Identity and access management service. So this is a service which manages access and permissions in AWS. So whenever you create a AWS account, so with that account, IAM service will be created, and this IAM service will be linked to your AWS account. So think of this IAM service as a database which has all the permissions stored in it. And when a user wants to perform any action on the AWS account, they have to go through this IAM service. And then from their IAM service, the IAM service will define whether this identity or user is allowed to access this service or not. So that's what IAM service is. As we can see here, that a user who wants to access these services, they have to go through this IAM firewall. This is not a firewall, but IAM service. Okay. So in this IAM service, we will define a set of permissions, and based on the permissions, the user can access the services if they are allowed to. If they are denied, they will not able to access any of the service.
Okay, so IAM is basically acting as the authorization part.
Yeah. Then let's talk about IAM identities. So there are primarily three types of identities in AWS. The first one is your user identity, which are your normal humans or normal users or applications. Then we have another identity which is called group. Group is like a collection of related users. So if you want a number of users to be assigned to a group, then you can use groups, and then you can assign permission to that group. Then all the users that are present in that group will inherit those permissions. Then we have the role, which is another identity in AWS. So role is mainly used to delegate permission to AWS services. So this is one of the identity which is not understood well. So I will explain it through an example. So let's suppose there is a service called EC2, a virtual machine, and they want to access some data that is stored on S3 service, right? But how can they access it? Because this has IAM policies, right?
Yes.
They cannot just access it. They need some credentials, right? So what we will do, first we will create a role. To that role, we can assign permissions.
Yes.
And then we can attach this role to the EC2 instance. Or we can say that the EC2 instance can assume that role. And once the EC2 instance can assume that role, it means that it can have all the permissions that we have set up in the role identity, and then using that permission, it can access the S3 resources that they want to access from the EC2 instance. So I hope role is clear to you, right?
Yeah.
Apart from that, we have a super user in AWS as well, that is called root user. And from that user, basically this root user has all the privileges in the environment, but you can create other users based on the privileges that you want to give to that user. Okay, that you can also do. But so generally in our pen test, the requirement from the client is that we want to escalate to the root user, or maybe we want to escalate to some storage services that they have stored their data in. So these are some of the requirements that comes from client. Basically the rules of engagement. Okay.
Also, I am pretty sure these are the main three things that you also told us at the services part, right? That was IAM and storage S3.
Yeah.
Another reason.
Yeah. Then we have access keys in AWS. So how a user can log in? They need credentials, right? So AWS provided two types of keys, which is called long-term keys and short-term keys. So long-term keys are used for consistent access to AWS resources or services. Basically, there are two types of long-term keys. First one is your user credentials that are normal, your username and password. And apart from that, AWS also has access keys, which are also long-term keys, which you can use it to programmatically access AWS resources or services. Okay, so it's like just a key ID, and it's just an ID and a key that you can use. And apart from that, AWS also offers short-term keys. So these are the temporary credentials that provide limited access to AWS services, like for a very short period of time. So generally it is done via temporary tokens. So the role that I told you, right?
Yes.
So when we assign a role, it will get a temporary token. And this token will be valid for 15 minutes to the 36-hour max. Okay, so these are the two types of access keys. Now, let's talk about IAM identity permissions policies. As I told you, all the authorization will happen through this IAM, and IAM has attached some set of policies, right? So yeah, what is this permission policy, right? How we can read it, right? So this permission policy is a set of security statements that allow or deny access to AWS resources, and we can attach these permission policies to the AWS identities, which are your users, groups, roles. So if let's suppose I want to give a user some permissions to access his files that is stored on AWS S3 bucket. So to this user, I will assign permissions. I will attach these permission policies, and in that permission policy, I will define how this user can access that and what resources in S3 bucket they can access. Don't worry, I am going to showcase how it will look like. So don't worry about that. And these permission policies are also known as policy document, and they are written in JSON format. Okay. So let's see this. So this is how the permission, this policy document will look like on your right hand side. So let's understand this. So first is the version, which is the version of the policy, which is by default it's 2012. So I think Microsoft have not updated it since 2012. Then we have a statement. In the statement, we will define the permission policies, right? So it starts with statement ID, which identifies the statement. It is an optional field, but it is like giving a small description to your statement, right? So in this case, this SID is set to S3 full access. It means that we want to give S3 full access to maybe some bucket, okay, as the name suggests. But as I said, it's an optional field. It's depend on the architect, whatever they want to give, right? Then we have the effect. So effect specifies whether the statement is allowed or denied. So if we want this user to allow some actions on some resources, we will give allow. And if we want the users to deny permission, we will just give deny. Okay. Then we have actions. So actions are a list of specific AWS service. So action is like what we want to perform on that resource, right? So in this scenario, we have a list bucket get S3 is the service name, then list bucket is the name of the action. So it's all defined in actions. We can give a list of actions as well. So we have, as in the example, it says S3 list bucket. It means we are allowing listing of the S3 bucket. And if we have get object, it means that we are allowing the identity to get that object. And finally, we have the resources. So resources are the actual, basically resources are the AWS resources like S3, EC2 on which we want to give access to the identity. So again, we have identity, we have resource. And if you want to give access to this resource, we have to attach some policy to this identity, right? And based on the identity, they can access. And if you see in this scenario, we have resource. The resource is defined that S3 bucket. So if we assign this or if we attach this permission policy to identity, it means they have full control, not the full control, but they can perform these actions like list buckets, get object, put object, delete object, basically full control of this on this resource, which is example bucket or example bucket / star. It means all the objects that are present in the example bucket. So they have all the access, all these actions on this example bucket or the object that are stored in this example bucket. Sure. So I hope this policy statement structure is clear, right? So this is very important to understand. So because you are going to see this a lot on your engagements, and you have to read it and you have to understand it so that you can know what is happening, because this is where misconfigurations can happen, right? So let's suppose that instead of this example bucket, if I have put just a star, it means that it will give access to all the S3 bucket, okay, right? So that's why this is very important to know. Now let's understand types of IAM policies. So this is the policy statement that I show. There are two types of policies in AWS. The first one is AWS managed policies. The first one is managed policies and second one is inline policies. And in the managed policies, it has two types of other policies, which is AWS managed policies and customer managed policies. So first, let's learn about what is AWS managed policies, right? So AWS managed policies are predefined policies that are created and maintained by AWS, and they are generally used for general purposes. So let's suppose, if you, again, same example, if you want to give full access to an S3 bucket, AWS already has a predefined policy for that. So you don't have to create one, right? You can directly take that policy and attach to the identity. Okay. Then we have customer managed policies. So this is generally used for customizations to the policies that the AWS has. So let's suppose that you are not happy with the managed policies permissions that are defined in it, and you want to customize it according to your need. Okay. At that time, you can go opt for customer managed policies. This policy you have to create. Okay. And then what's the difference? And this let's talk about inline policies. So these inline policies are directly attached to the user. Okay. But the main difference, so you might be thinking, what is the difference between managed policies and inline policies, right? So managed policies are shared. Okay. So if you are using managed policy, okay, then you can attach a managed policy to n number of identities. Okay. But in case of inline policies, it is directly created and attached to a single identity. You cannot reuse it, or you cannot share it with other identities. Okay. So that's the major difference between managed policies and inline policies. So if you want, so let's suppose there is an identity and they want some specific access. So you can just create an inline policy and attach it to them then and there. Don't have to opt for managed policies. Okay, but if you want policies that you want to apply on n number of identities, let's suppose to all the users in a company, then you can opt for managed policies. And because these are shared, right? Yeah. So whatever settings in that policy will be affected to all the identities. Okay. So these are the two types of IAM policies. I know it's a lot of theory because before going to the practice, you have to understand this theory part so that you will be able to understand it properly.
Sure. Can you give the viewers a quick recap of all the stuff that we discussed right now?
Yeah, so we started off with the AWS. Why AWS? Why companies are switching to AWS? Then we see how can we perform a penetration test of AWS. And then we started off with the IAM, which is one of the major services that you need to know. Yes. So that's why we are taking a bit of time on these IAM policies, because they are very important, because all the permission and authorization will go through this service. Exactly. So that's why it's
and it's always great, even though it's theory, but it's always great to understand what's really happening.
Anyway, you have to learn it.
That's true.
Right. So now let's talk about Amazon resource name, short for ARN. Mm-hmm. So ARN basically identifies a resource. Mm-hmm. So there are lots of resources in AWS, right? Yes. So how you can uniquely identify that? Mm-hmm. So you can uniquely identify using ARN. So ARN is just a string which uniquely identifies a resource in AWS. And it is used to refer a single resource or a group of resources. If you see my previous example here, you see in the resource section, you see two ARNs there, yes, right? So first one is to specify a specific object, which is the S3 bucket, which is example bucket in our case. Mm-hmm. And if we want to specify or a list of objects, then you can use this bucket /star. It means it will point to all the objects in that bucket. So a group of objects that you can also specify using ARN. Then this is the format of ARN. So first we have ARN, then we have the partition name. Partition name is generally AWS, unless you are operating in China. For China, it is AWS-CHN. But most of the time you will see AWS as the ARN. Okay. AWS as the partition. Then we have the service name. So which can be your, if the resource is a EC2 instance service, it will show EC2. If your resource is a S3 bucket, it will show S3 there. Yes. So based on the service, it will change. Then we have the region in which your service is in. So region can be like AP South one, which is for Mumbai, US West one for Virginia. I think US East one is for Virginia. So this is how you can define. Yes. Then we have the account ID, which is the account ID of the AWS account. Then finally we have the resource ID. Okay, so this is how you can uniquely specify a resource using ARN. So this is the format that AWS follows. Yeah, the other format is the below one, in which you will specify, if you see in the end, it's resource type / resource ID. And these are some of the few examples that I have given. So the first example is that we are basically representing a AWS instance, EC2 instance. So this is how you can do that. First we have the ARN, it starts with ARN, then the partition name, which is AWS, then the name of the service, which is EC2, then we have the name of the region, which is AP-South 1, which is the Mumbai region, and then we have the name of the account. Finally, we will have the resource type, which is instance, and then the / resource ID, which is the ID of the EC2 instance. Also another thing that AWS services, some of the AWS services are global and some of them are regional. So if it is a regional service, then this is the first format it will follow. But if it is a global service, it will not have the AWS account or the region. So that's why you will see ARN AWS S3 : images. It will not have the region as well as the account ID because it's a global service, right? And if you want to represent a group of resources, then you can use the wildcard, which is /*. So in this case, it is representing all the objects in this images bucket. So I hope now you have an idea of how you can uniquely identify a resource in AWS using ARN. Okay.